Hey guys, welcome back for another One Piece video. Today we actually have the 7 best budget decks you can build right now. We just entered the EB02 meta. Everybody is trying to find a deck that they like, feels fresh, but most importantly, is affordable. I know you've been looking at green purple Luffy prices, Bonnie prices, Shanks prices, Lucci prices. A lot of these decks have reached up to that $200, some of them even $300 price point. But don't worry, because the 7 deck lists that I've got today are all less than $120. And if you're thinking $120 is a lot for you, don't worry, because I have decks all the way down from $30 up to that $120 price point. So I'm sure that we can find something that fits for you. In just a couple of seconds, I'll jump into the criteria that I did for building these decks, as well as how I went about constructing them, all of the nice information that you need to know before you even go about purchasing any of these decks. So stay tuned for that. We'll jump right over there. Okay, jumping into that criteria that I mentioned before. All of these decks and prices, I actually manually plugged into TCG Player myself as of May 22nd. So the prices that you'll see here should be the general prices that would be the same for you when you actually go to purchase or build the decks. Obviously, if you're looking at a couple months down the line, I imagine prices would change by then, but as of right now, these should be the general prices if you were to go and build the deck today. And like I said, all of these decks are meta relevant. Any of these I fully believe could get top 32 or top 16 within the next couple of weeks to a month right before OP11. Don't worry, they're not gimmicks. They're all fully legal decks. They all make tons of sense. And I'm sure some of you guys have an idea of a couple that might pop up on the list. I know for a fact one of them, at least I hope for a fact one of them, you guys would find as a bit of a surprise, but does make sense. And at the very end, I'm actually going to go over a tier list. Not a complete meta tier list, really just a tier list for these 7 decks in terms of how I would rank them in terms of potential and power, not in terms of cost. The way I'm going to go through the video will be from lowest cost to highest cost, but that doesn't mean from best to worst or worst to best. I'll go through that kind of tier ranking at the very end, so make sure to stay tuned until the very end. But other than that, let's go ahead and jump into the very first deck that's on the list. All right, guys, for the very first deck that we do have is Belo Betty, coming at only $35 to build. If you're looking for a very aggressive kind of play style, you're flooding the board, you're just rushing down your opponent's life, I don't really think there's a better deck that I could really recommend to you. Even more so than Zoro, I would say this deck can go just as fast with a little bit bigger numbers even earlier. So if you're looking for a deck that you can get cards out of life onto board, you're just going kind of glass cannony right out the gates, just going full, no breaks pretty much, then I would say this deck is something you're looking for. And in terms of matchups, what you can expect, the green purple Luffy matchup isn't really that bad. I would say it's probably 55-45 in terms of Betty's favor. I think Electrical Luna on green purple side can sway that a bit, but the deck can definitely contend against those. You might have a bit of a rough time against Shanks, Bonnie, maybe Lucci if they can see enough of their early game, because those decks will really drain your resources. And that's probably Betty's #1 weakness, is the fact that their resources can get depleted very quickly due to using so much pressure in the early sections of the game. And in terms of ranking, I would consider this a tier 1.5 deck. If we have tier 1 kind of classified as green purple Luffy, Lucci, Shanks, and then maybe Bonnie at the end of that, just because it has a really good green purple matchup, that's kind of what I would consider the tier 1 just for the sake of this video. I would say Betty's a tier 1.5 because not only can it contend well against green purple, it can contend well against the rest of 1.5. In terms of how hard it is to play this deck, don't take offense to this if you are a Belo Betty player, but I think this is a relatively easy deck to play. You pretty much take second in about 90% of your matchups, and you really just want to play down as many bodies as you can and use your leader skill to just buff your attackers and just swing face as many times as possible. Obviously, there are nuances to every deck and every game in terms of what's optimal here and there, but in terms of what you want to do turn to turn, I would say this is a relatively easy deck. So if an aggressive style of play where you're pretty much a glass cannon, you're rushing down your opponent is something that you're interested in, you really can't go wrong for a deck that only costs $35. And for deck number 2, we actually have one of my personal favorites, Blue Black Usopp. Also coming in at only $35, this deck really brings forth a kind of tempo control play style. If you're interested in controlling your opponent's early board as well as mid game, I would say this is a deck for you. You can build board efficiently, you can remove your opponent's board relatively efficiently, and due to the leader skill of whenever one of your characters that's cost 3 or greater, or I believe 2 or greater, is removed from the field by any effect during your opponent's turn, you can draw 1 if you have 5 or less in hand. So the resource game for this deck is pretty consistent, and you have access to 2 different searches in the deck. You have a pretty good top end of the Kairos as well as the Luffy. You have the double attack plus 6k event, assuming your trash is 15, so you can apply pressure out of nowhere if you really need to. I think this is a really good deck if you do prefer kind of that tempo control style. You can even get pretty wide with this board due to the 7 cost Rebecca. I think this deck targets a lot of different ranges to make use, and depending on the matchup, you can go in different directions. This is one of my personal favorites. I would rank this deck as probably a 1.5 to tier 2. The reason for that is just because of its matchup spread overall right now. I think its green-purple matchup can be a little bit tough. It kind of comes down to how many times you can see your double attack event, as well as if you have the reduction to combo with Kairos and bounce back their Sanji Puddings as well as their Rush Luffy consistently enough and keep their board low enough so you don't have to deal with the pressure. You have a lot of blockers in this deck, which is nice. You can stave off some of those attacks. But if we're looking at the meta of Bonnie, Shanks, and green-purple Luffy, as well as Lucci, although you have a very good Lucci matchup, your opponent can usually deal with your units relatively consistently, whether through resting or through removal if we're talking about Shank's side. So just something to keep note of. I think just matchup-wise, it is between that 1.5 and 2 slot, but I'm leaning more to 1.5. Very good deck, although not the easiest to pilot. I think you really have to know what you're doing with this deck in order to make the most use out of it, whether that's through your KOs or your removals or what you're deciding to play out from turn to turn, but also really knowing when to take your life in this deck, because your leader skill is more or less restricted to you being at 5 or less in hand. So to make sure that that's always live, you have to know when to counter efficiently as well as when to take life efficiently, and also to know when to let your characters go from the board if they're getting attacked into. So in my opinion, Usopp is a great deck to look into if you like that kind of tempo control style. Get wide, remove your opponent's board if you need to, and go from there. So if that sounds like something for you, you also can't go wrong because it's only $35. So feel free to look into it. In slot number 3, we have Reiju. Blue Purple Reiju. This deck is really rising up in the ranks pretty quickly as of now. I've been hearing a lot of chatter in terms of people being very interested in Reiju because it is a value deck as well as kind of tempo deck. You're able to build hand back super quickly. You can build a board super quickly. You have the access to the Porsche, which lets you cheat out so many bodies. You get wide deceptively fast with this deck. And because every single time you don -1s per turn with the leader skill, you're drawing at least 1. If you have the Reiju character, most times you're drawing 3 cards in hand. Very rarely do I ever see a Reiju have less than 5 cards in hand. And if they are, they're probably in a very losing spot. But I don't feel like I see that happen that often. This deck, if you're looking for a relatively complex deck, because I don't think this deck is the easiest to pilot. If we have an aggressive kind of get wide deck to compare to, such as Belo Betty, I would say this deck is a fair amount harder to pilot. You need to see your pieces accordingly. You need to know really the combo strings that you're going for. I would put this as a tier 1.5 deck because I think it does do pretty well into the meta. It has a pretty decent Lucci matchup because you go so fast. I think the green-purple matchup, you can get wide and contend with your board, and through your Ichijis allow you to kind of control the green-purple's board a little bit. I think this is a great deck if you like kind of that combo play style, build a board, generate resources continually, even into that late game, and really just keep up constant pressure against your opponent in a healthy kind of way. But like I said, it's not quite like Betty in terms of aggro because you really need to know what you're doing with this deck. But for $45, really great price point of getting into the game. One of the more complex, but also more fun decks that myself, other people I know have really enjoyed playing throughout. And like I said, it's really rising up in the ranks in terms of interest that people have if they don't want to go kind of that tier 1 specific route and go something more affordable. So I would recommend checking it out. Definitely something to keep your eye on because you will see these start creeping up at the top 16. It's got the potential. Coming into number 4, we are over halfway through the list. We have Lim. So Lim is coming in at only $65. So we have jumped about $30 from the very first list, but $65 for a really good deck, not much you can complain about too much, especially when compared to other decks in this game. Lim is a relatively aggro style of deck, I would say. You want to go first with this deck. I don't know if there's any matchup you really want to go second with this deck because Lim has probably one of the strongest curves in the game. Dawn 3, use your leader skill, cheat out a 5-cost body. On 6 Dawn, leader skill, get a 5-cost body and play the 3-drop searcher. And then on 9 Dawn, you can use leader skill again to cheat out a body, play another body. So you get wide with this deck with 5-cost bodies very quickly. And not only is that getting your board extremely wide, but when you start attacking, you're asking your opponent to give you 2Ks very often. So it just whittles your opponent's defenses down so quickly that by the time that they're wanting to be in a stage to actually get back in the fight, the resources are too low to really handle what you're doing. And they're probably not at a safe spot with their life either because of how much pressure and aggression that you're putting in. I've seen a ton of limbs. You've probably heard about a ton of limbs too, topping events, you know, going undefeated because whether it's die roll dependent or not, I mean, you know, luck has to play into tournament runs here and there. But this deck is maybe the number 1 or 2 going first deck in the game just because of how much further ahead it can get over the course of the game if it does go first. You gain so much advantage. Where would I put this deck? I think this is an easy tier 1.5 deck. I think you can make the argument it could be tier 1. It just depends on the matchup spread as well as I think going first or second. It's a little bit inconsistent, kind of dice roll reliant to an extent. It's not impossible to win going second, but just your odds tank so much more. So I think 1.5 is fair because it's relatively inconsistent to an extent. In terms of how hard it is to play, I would say it's about a moderate difficulty. Wouldn't call it quite as easy as Belo Betty, but I don't think it's nearly as hard as Reiju to play. So a good moderate style, $65 deck. If you go first, you're looking in a great spot, tons of aggression. If that sounds like your style, then I would definitely give them a shot. I know a ton of people who like this deck, bring it to tourneys, regionals, very confident. You can't go wrong. Our 5th deck that we're looking into is actually Blackbeard. I think this is probably one of the more controversial ones that I'll have on this list, but the reason that it's here is, one, it's only $65. It's super cheap to build and put together. It's kind of nice because most of the cards, there's only like 2 or 3 SRs in the deck. So there's not a whole lot of expensive cards you have to worry about collecting. But this is here for, one, it's only $65, so it's cheap to build. And 2, it has a start deck coming on the way. And about 80% of the cards that you would need to build the base of this deck is included in the start deck that's coming out, which shouldn't be any more than about $12 to $20, depending on where you buy it from. But this is going to be a very easy deck for a lot of people to assemble very quickly. The playstyle might not be for everyone. It's a pretty control, kind of stall playstyle. You want to make sure you're living your early game healthy enough so that we can get to your 10 Dawn, play your Blackbeard 10-drop teaches back to back, pretty much suffocate your opponent out the game. You get your Burgesses established. You're swinging like 9 to 12k attacks at least 1 to 3 times a turn, depending on your board. I think this deck is very strong. The reason it's a little bit controversial right now is because of the green-purple Luffy matchup. That's a very tough matchup because they go so fast. They have the stage to kind of help, you know, the little removal that you do have into that matchup. You really can't get to your late game as safely as you would like. It's not an impossible matchup because you can run techs like Liberation, deal with the original cost of your opponent's characters. So you have some outs in that matchup. You got a great Lucci matchup, which is arguably the 2nd best deck right now. Maybe 3rd. I would kind of say Shanks and Lucci are like neck and neck for me. And you have a very good Shanks matchup as well into the control Shanks variant. Because they're so slow, your ability to keep your board healthy because they only have a couple of characters that can trash, and you can just negate the on-play for that. So your matchup into control Shanks, your matchup into Lucci are very strong. It just so happens that the best deck in the format is your greatest weakness. But that doesn't mean that it's unwinnable, which is why I threw this deck in here. I think it's very viable. It's got a pretty decent matchup spread overall. It's not the worst. But this is a relatively hard deck to play, in my opinion, because you have to know how every other deck in the game operates to know when to ditch your card for leader skill to shut off their on-plays. If you don't have very good general game knowledge and knowing matchups extremely well, I don't know if I would recommend this deck quite to you. And knowing when to take your life and when to counter is extremely important. This deck often can get pretty low in hand size because you do have to ditch for that leader skill more or less once a turn, depending on when you use it. So it's very likely that this deck doesn't have a whole lot of cards in hand, but the cards you do have in hand are extremely important because this deck has a ton of searches, so the consistency is very high. You can grab your 2Ks for defensive when you need it. You can grab your 10-cost teaches when you need it, your 5-drop Kuzons, recur your Burgesses and trash. It's a relatively technical deck. I know a lot of people simplify it, but there are a fair amount of nuances to the timing with this deck, the proper ways to go about the curve to curve with this deck. I think this is a very fair deck to pick up right now if you want to. Maybe not even for the EB meta, but going to set 11 because you'll have access to that structure deck. But for $65, a tier 1.5 deck that could easily be tier 1 come those starter decks and into set 11, I don't think you can go wrong with this. It's pretty good entry point. Like I said, a little hard to master and pick up, but it could be something you just look forward for the future. Just keep it in mind. Coming into our number 6 slot, probably the deck I'm most excited to bring up on here because I think this deck can be very good and is 100% a sleeper pick, and that is green blue Rosinante. So this deck costs $80, which is a little surprising. You probably wouldn't think so because it's not a very popular deck, but just because of some cards that you have to include in the deck, they're a little bit pricier. But this is a pretty control kind of stall play style. It's an 8-drop kid deck, and if anybody knows about 8-drop kid decks, they're usually very good into green purple Luffy, which is why we have it on this list. I don't think a lot of people know how to play properly against this deck. A lot of people don't know how to pilot this deck either, so that's 2 things to consider. But I think this is a quality deck that if you want a similar playstyle, maybe a little bit too red-green smoker, but that deck might just be a little bit too pricey for you, this is a great alternative. It's a little bit more of a defensive version, I would say, than the offensive power and removal that red-green smoker has access to. But because you have 8-drop kid with this deck, you have good removal events through Red Rock, through Gravity Blade, whatever it may be. You also have access to the Cavendish, which is a very big card in this deck where you can essentially start drawing additional cards turn after turn after turn. And because of your leader skill, you can protect your searchers in the early game by using your leader to actually block and save them. Because with this deck, you're very much fine with using your leader skill to block and absorb the life hit. That way you can technically draw cards and you protect your units on your board, so you don't have to worry about countering from hand for those cards. So this is a very sleeper pick in my opinion. It's definitely not a deck that I think most people would expect to play against, but the viability is very much there, especially if you plan to play against a lot of green purples. You should definitely look into it. I would say this is a pretty solid tier 2 deck. Most of the other decks that we've looked at so far have been tier 1.5. I think this falls right into kind of that tier 2 spot because the matchup spread into other decks isn't going to be that great, but your matchup spread into green purple Luffy is looking very nice. In terms of how hard I think this deck is to play and master, I would give it a hard ranking. You could maybe say moderate, but because I think this deck is so unknown, the technicalities when it comes to using your leader skill to block and protect your units and take a life, as well as knowing how you need to navigate your kind of uncharted watered matchups, I would say this is a relatively hard deck to play because you're going to have to figure it out. There aren't like a whole bunch of Rosinante resources out there, so it's going to come down to you to figure out how each matchup is supposed to go. But I would definitely recommend this deck. One of my friends actually put together the deck list that we have provided here, as well as some resources from Kai. I don't know how to pronounce his actual YouTube name, but Kai, the Japanese YouTuber, also some reference from his deck list as well. So the credibility for the deck is there, I would say. Something to look into. This is definitely the most fun pick of the 7 bunch. And if you want something even just a little bit different, I would recommend giving this a shot. Coming into the very last number 7 option for the budget deck list, we have Vegapunk. Vegapunk has slowly crept up to over $100, sitting at roughly $105 to build if you were to build it today. I don't think anybody really saw this coming, but due to the support that it got in EB02 with that SR Vegapunk, this deck now is kind of making waves. I've been hearing it pop up here and there. I've been playing against it a little bit myself. It's a strong deck. I think this deck is easily tier 1.5. It's got a pretty decent matchup spread because you can get wide extremely quickly. It's kind of mid-rangey. It's a little bit of aggro. You get bodies out quickly. You don't die quickly because you can always use leader skill to put a card into life. And the removal is pretty interesting because you can dominate the early game very easily due to your Namis, due to your Luffys that pop 5 and 4 costs. So the chances of your opponent having units that stick early game is just super low. So I think this deck, it's probably one of the more technical decks as well. I don't think this deck is super easy to master right away. You're really going to have to know what units you need to be playing out turn per turn, when to use your leader skill to play units versus when to use your leader skill to put cards into life, as well as really keeping track of what cards you've seen so that when you have your recursion effects through a couple of cards that are trigger effects or when dying and what units you're bringing back, I would say it's pretty technical to think about, maybe more so than some people think. But in terms of viability, I think this deck has a pretty decent matchup spread into the pool. Green purple Luffy, I think you can get enough bodies out consistently to keep up with their kind of tempo and, you know, aggressiveness they naturally have. The Lucci matchup is probably slightly unfavored for you. I think Lucci's removal is just really good right now overall. Not that the matchup's unwinnable. I would say it's probably like 60-40 Lucci in my opinion, because, you know, Brook is a really good card. You know, they got the Kuzan and stuff. Yeah, that you have your early game to really deal with those 4 costs, 5 costs and lower. But I would say overall, if they can get to their late game pretty safely, start seeing some of their bigger bodies and, you know, get those Tempest kicks going in live, you might be in a bit of a rough spot if you're not already a bit ahead of them. In terms of Shanks, I think you can get pretty wide quickly, but if they can get to their late game like any Shanks player, start spamming out those big bodies, you might be in a bit of a rough spot. Bonnie is probably pretty unfavored because they can stall you out pretty hard. 8-cost Kid is a relatively tough thing for this deck to deal with unless they have 8-drop Katakuri. That's a great out to the Kid. But other than that, I think this deck can catch a lot of people by surprise. I've been seeing it creep up. We already saw it in, I believe, this past weekend's Treasure Cup, make top 32 or top 16, so the viability of the deck is there. The new SR Vegapunk is great. You can go even wider, even faster. There's a couple of cool things that when you get the event out of life and you play the Vegapunk from your trash, you can then get another card from your deck to then play out. So you're kind of going plussing just for taking a life. And if you grab the 3-cost Searcher to play it out, you're going pretty much net even, if not plus overall. So there's a lot of technicalities to this deck. Not the easiest to play in my opinion, but definitely something to keep your eye on. It's already got the topping credentials under its belt. And for $105 for a maybe top of the tier 1.5 list, I don't think you can go too wrong with picking up Vegapunk. And it's the only yellow deck, or aside from Betty, that we have on the list, so definitely check it out. Wrapping up the video here, I just kind of want to go over a bit of a comparison chart that we have. It's going to be laid out just in terms of each deck, the price of the deck, the play style of the deck, how strong I think the deck is. They're all relatively, like I said, pretty much around that tier 1.5, maybe bleeding into 2 range, but I think overall these are the best budget options that you have right now in terms of price as well as viability. If any of these decks click with you, I would definitely say pick them up right now. We got about, what, 2-ish weeks left in the EBO meta specifically, but some of these decks I think will continue viability over into set 11, not only with new cards from set 11, but also because the meta is just going to be the complete Wild West. We have some ideas of some decks that will still maintain relevancy, but you'll have a good chance of surprising anybody with anything come set 11, early set 11 at least. Now, in terms of my personal tier list of viability that I think these 7 decks would kind of fall into, I would say the best deck out of these, not considering price, strictly in terms of strength and viability into the meta right now, I would put Vegapunk number 1. I would say Reiju number 2, Teach number 3, Lim number 4, Usopp number 5, Belo Betty number 6, and sadly Rosinante number 7. Not because it's a trash deck, just because in strength comparisons to the rest of the 7, it does definitely fall on the end tail of that, as well as its matchup spread isn't as good as the other decks into the meta. But yeah, overall, that's what I was kind of give as a list of the 7 that we went over here today. I think they're all viable, like I said, and if you're looking for a deck that's under $120, well, here you go. You got 7 options to pick from, and hopefully we see, some more support for each of these decks coming down the way. Some of them we already know have guaranteed support, but definitely some fun decks to keep your eye on, contentious in the meta. I will provide all the deck lists and things below in the description from Eggman Events websites. It's some of them that I told you I pulled from the regionals, some of them I built myself, just some things to mess around with. And yeah, other than that, let me know what you guys decide to fall onto if you're deciding to build one of these decks. Let me know if you have any questions for them. I don't play all these decks, but I have a pretty good knowledge base of how every single one of these operate. So if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. But other than that, thanks for checking out this video. Share it to any people you want or trying to get into One Piece, because this would be a great video for them. Kind of some good points to pick up on. And yeah, thanks for watching, checking out, and we'll catch you in the next one. Peace.